Good evening and welcome to this New Israel Fund Australia event. My name is Leanne Basser. I've been involved in New Israel Fund Australia since its establishment, having been a founding board member, and I currently serve on the Advisory Council. I'd like to start by acknowledging that even though we're all experiencing this event virtually, physically, we are on what has been and always will be Aboriginal land. I myself am on the land of the Bunurong and Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging, and to any Indigenous people here tonight. In the aftermath of a nail-biting US presidential election, the theme of tonight's webinar, Democracy in Danger, is very timely. Democratic values, those ideas or beliefs that underpin Western societies, and particularly our societies in Australia, the US, and Israel, include freedom of assembly and political participation, equality for all, freedom of speech, the rule of law, and importantly, which is equality before and under the law. These values are under severe challenge, as witnessed in the recent US presidential election, and as we have seen in Israel and in fact in the US as well in recent years. The election of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris gives us some hope for the future. It is now my pleasure to introduce Roger Cohen, columnist for the New York Times and author of numerous books, including his family memoir, The Girl from Human Street, Ghosts of Memory in a Jewish Family, which was published in 2015. Roger was raised in South Africa and England, and he's a naturalized American. I'm also very delighted to introduce Professor Naomi Chazan. Naomi was born in Jerusalem during the British Mandate. She is synonymous with an Israel that defends human rights, promotes equality, and seeks a peaceful resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Naomi's commitment to building an Israel as envisaged by the Declaration of Independence has seen her in various roles, such as the Deputy Speaker of the Knesset for Meretz, a senior Israeli academic activist for women's rights, and former president of the New Israel Fund. Now, before I hand over to Liam and our speakers, as many of you here may not be familiar with the work of the New Israel Fund. The New Israel Fund is a partnership between Israeli and diaspora Jews committed to upholding the values of Israel's Declaration of Independence, values that promote a more inclusive, just, and equitable Israel for everyone who lives there. Since it was created in the late 1970s in San Francisco, the New Israel Fund has invested more than $500 million in hundreds of projects in Israel informed by these founding values. The New Israel Fund community is made up from people all around the world who come together to make a real impact on the ground in Israel. Our mission is to provide as much funding as we can for grassroots organisations to shape the reality on the ground. Making an impact means reducing social and economic gaps, especially those felt by women, Israel's Arab citizens, and Israelis living in regional towns. It means combating systemic discrimination and racism experienced by refugees and people seeking asylum, Jewish immigrants from Ethiopia and the former Soviet Union, the LGBTQ community, and Palestinian citizens of Israel. It means working with millions of Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza who suffer daily under the Israeli occupation. That's the work of the New Israel Fund in a nutshell. Now I will pass you across to our Executive Director, Liam Getreu, who will moderate the discussion with Roger and Naomi.
Thank you, Leanne. Thank you to our friends, our wonderful friends, Roger Cohen and Naomi Chazan, for joining us for this great event. We've got more than 500 people registered, so I want to thank everyone at home for joining us as well. As part of getting these two incredible visionaries joining us here in Australia, we've recorded this conversation earlier today at about 1 p.m. In New York. And I say that where you are, Roger, because I think that if there's going to be any breaking news between now and then. It's probably going to happen in your time zone.
Yeah.
So that's where news will break. So you'll forgive us, everyone, if something does happen between now and then. We're going to cover a lot of topics tonight, and I want to start by talking about the election itself and everything that's happened in the week or so since then. We know the result by this point. Joe Biden is the president-elect. It was a rocky ride Wednesday evening here in Australia. I think a lot of us were riding the wave of our Twitter streams as we waited for votes to come in and out. The big question we probably don't know right now is what Donald Trump will do. So, Roger, I just wanted to start with you to get your reflections on the last week or so and where you see things politically standing right now.
Thank you very much, Liam. And hi, Naomi. Great to be with you. You're right, Liam. It was certainly a roller coaster election night. And for a moment, at least for me, there were queasy feelings of 2016 returning as the early returns showed Donald Trump leading. Since then, through a painstaking count, it's clear that Joe Biden is indeed, as you put it, the president-elect and won a narrow victory in this 2020 poll. It's worth recording, of course, that President Trump won Michigan by 0.2% and won Wisconsin, Pennsylvania by under 0.8%. And yet the very next day, Hillary Clinton conceded and the normal democratic process went ahead that enabled President Trump to take office almost 4 years ago. This time around, that is not the case. President Trump has refused to concede. He claims that there has been massive fraud. There is no proof or even indication of such fraud, and yet he claims it. He is being abetted in this operation by Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, who, despite urging countries like Iran to become democracies, yesterday openly flouted American democracy by saying, in response to a question, yes, we are preparing actively for the transition, a transition to a second Trump term. Ha, 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 ha. And of course, the Republican Party, which should really be called the Trump Party today, led by Mitch McConnell, also choosing to abet President Trump in this attempted heist. It has to be said that this is absolutely no surprise. As Mitt Romney, one of the few dissenting Republicans, said, it would be nice if President Trump conceded graciously, but that's just not in the man. That's just not in the man. For the American people to say to Donald Trump, "You're fired," the words he used so often on his hit TV show, The Apprentice, "You're fired," is absolutely intolerable psychologically to Donald Trump. He has been actively preparing the ground for this for months now. He started in about July, claiming with no evidence again that mail-in ballots, absentee ballots, were certain to be fraudulent. And of course, as our listeners will know, with the pandemic raging here in the United States, there were many more people who chose not to go to the polls, to a crowded place, and to vote by mail. And of those people, more were Democrats than Republicans, because Democrats have tended to take the virus more seriously than the president himself or some of his Republican followers. So he's prepared the ground for this. It was a close enough election for him to put the operation to embark on this operation of trying to deny the will of the American people. It is today Trump versus the American people. This is a travesty of American democracy. You asked me what President Trump is going to do. I could go into that in some detail, but I think I'll refrain from that for now in order to bring Naomi into the conversation. But suffice to say, this is going to go on for weeks. President Trump will not concede. He will not. He will fight this right down to the line. And as you know, the results are not certified until the Electoral College meets on December 14. We are now, I believe, November 11. That leaves more than a month for him to do his worst.
We're definitely going to talk. What I would like to get you to do is a kind of best case, worst case scenario on what you think Trump will do in the next month. So Naomi, I'll definitely bring you in. You're obviously not in America, but as you know, as someone who's written and spoken about democracy a lot, this must give you kind of chills seeing the system play out like this.
Yes, I must admit, you may have had a day or two of jitters. I had about 5, and they were all-nighters because of the time differences. And I can't remember having such anxiety over an election that is not my own election ever in my life, which gives us some indication of the importance of these elections for liberal Democrats, I think, throughout the globe. And don't forget also that I'm coming from a country in Israel where over 70% of the population supported Trump in the polls. And when I had to begin to wonder what's going on here and look at the elections through a democratic prism rather than one of Israel's penchant to see everything through its narrow Israeli perspective. So having said that, I want to highlight one thing, which is something that we have rarely seen as a real problem in democratic elections up to now. And we've seen now in a very dramatic fashion in the United States, and that is the significance of the electoral process in the robustness or the unraveling of democratic regimes. This is the first time that I recall in a sweeping manner that the ABC of elections, that you go to vote and then your vote is not counted, or attempts are made to minimize and negate the importance of your vote, has come so much to the fore. That means it's not a question just of long-term processes, but the capacity of somebody who does not respect democratic conventions to upturn the democratic process in its, again, most essential sense, the right to vote and to be elected in such a manner. And by the way, it does have an Israeli corollary, if I can bring Israel into the picture for a minute, in that many Israelis 3 times in the last 18 months went to the polls in order to vote out Benjamin Netanyahu, Bibi, and in a sense succeeded numerically, but not actually, because in the final round, the key opposition to Netanyahu joined him in a coalition, creating a sense of deep betrayal, but highlighting again how the electoral process can help unravel democratic countries. And that's the point that I take away from what's going on in the United States in a very dramatic kind of way.
So one thing we're definitely going to talk about is the role of oppositions within democracies, and both within, I guess, in terms of Trump, the ruling power, the ruling party, but also more generally in society. So we're definitely going to get to that soon because I think it's a very interesting point. I do want to ask to get you to talk now, Roger, about that point of what will Trump do? What's the kind of best and worst case scenario for the next month or so? How much
the
have it
best
can he
case, the best case scenario, Liam, is also, unfortunately, I think, the illusory scenario, which is that Trump will, for once in his life, respect the facts, respect the truth. He has spent his entire 4 years in the presidency lying on a daily basis, and he's a man who I think genuinely does not know the difference between truth and falsehood. I think Donald Trump could utter 4 different lies in a day, take 4 lie detector tests, and pass them all, because he doesn't know when he is lying. This is a deep psychological condition that is pretty grave. So the chances that he will yield to the facts, especially when, as I said, it is a close election. But as Naomi said, in an election, every vote, that's the essence of democracy. Every vote gets counted, and each vote counts. And this is what President Trump is trying to deny. So that is the best case scenario, because that would show respect for the democratic process, which already is being skewed in very, very significant ways. The White House is vetting potential officials for a second Trump term. Joe Biden is not getting the Secret Service protection that a president-elect normally gets. The Trump administration is preparing a budget for February of 2021. All this is a very direct flouting of American democracy and the essential process, the ABC, as Naomi said, of a functioning democratic state. The worst case scenario, and what I think we're about to see Donald Trump try to do, and it was significant in my view that Mike Pompeo referred yesterday, I don't have the exact quote, but he referred to the process going forward, and the electors will convene next month, and then we will have a president. What I think may well happen is this. In Michigan, in Pennsylvania, in Wisconsin, and in Georgia, you have Republican-controlled legislatures. Trump is going to spend the next month trying to produce a shred of evidence of this fraud that he says took place. Republican-controlled legislatures could credit these allegations of voter fraud. It's conceivable. In fact, it's more than conceivable. They would then reject all absentee and mail-in ballots, only allow in-person votes, and certify the results to Trump electors in the Electoral College in those 4 states. And that could be enough to swing the election. But there's thankfully another side to this, and one of which, of course, is the facts, and I want to believe they still count, which is that Biden won the election. 3 of those states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, not Georgia, have Democratic governors and secretaries of state, and they would certify a Biden election, a Biden win. So you could have a disputed outcome, and eventually you could conceivably have the House, in which the Democrats have retained control, certify Biden, and the Senate certify Trump. And you're then in pretty uncharted territory. There will be various legal challenges that could end up in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is skewed, of course, toward the right, toward Trump, especially after Amy Coney Barrett's appointment as justice was rammed through in pretty obscene fashion in the last few days before the election. You could have conceivably the Supreme Court decide it, or you could have the Supreme Court say what has to happen, and that could be to hand it back to the House to decide. And in the House, there's a complicated voting process by state, which, for reasons that I won't go into, despite the fact that the Democrats have a majority in the House, would in fact probably lead to Trump being certified as president. So there are all kinds of, ominous, dark scenarios. The fact is that 74 million people voted for Joe Biden. Joe Biden won. And those 74 million Americans, I don't believe they're going to stand by and watch as an attempt is made, if it goes in the direction I just described, stand by and watch as Trump tries to do this. You could then have a pretty ugly situation in my country.
Naomi, did you want to reflect on that? That's it really could get very bad, is what Roger's saying.
I hear him, and before these elections and the protracted counting process, I tended to underestimate the bleak scenarios I was hearing from my American colleagues and friends. I no longer underestimate these scenarios. I can insert perhaps a wish that what might happen is something between the best case scenario and the worst case scenario, which would still certify and sanction the election of Biden. But if I can just reflect on what we just heard, which is, by the way, thoroughly alarming. Thoroughly alarming.
I'm about to write about this, Naomi, in my next and actually my penultimate column, because the full menace of it has only recently. I'm sorry, I'm interrupting you, but I think what set me off was Trump replacing most of the top officials in the Pentagon. If you're going to attempt some kind of democratic coup, you want the Defense Department on your side, and this is what Trump is busy organizing.
Yeah, and that makes me even more worried. Thank you very much, Roger.
Yeah, sorry.
But it also raises a paradox, and I just want to put it on the table, if I may. And Trump himself clearly lost the election. But the United States is totally polarized in its aftermath. In other words, even voters made a distinction between Trump and what we're now calling Trumpism. And it's the polarization and how to begin to deal with it that becomes the major challenge, because the alternative to such a stark binary division is frankly what you're hinting at. It's a coup on one side or a civil war of sorts on the other. And in a sense, the specifics of what you're talking about unfortunately might lead in this direction. And therefore, I really want to highlight how the polarization issue, not the personal one so much as the polarization issue, will outlive the immediate outcome, whatever it is.
One of the things that was...
Yeah, I think it's worth, quickly, Liam. I think it's worth noting that in 1860, when certain states did not agree to Lincoln's victory in the election, what did they do? They seceded. And we know what followed that. civil war was just used by Naomi, and several 100,000 deaths. I think it's quite plausible to imagine, speaking of the aftermath, some kind of virtual secession in which those 70 million plus voters who voted for Trump and that America effectively secedes from an America of which President Biden, which Joe Biden is the president. Even today, I saw that a Republican from Missouri, I think a member of the local legislature in Missouri, sorry, not Mississippi, not Missouri, Mississippi, called for certain states to secede from the Union.
I mean, that would have been unthinkable even just a few years ago, and it's kind of, it shows how much. You both said this, I think, how much Trumpism has overtaken the Republican Party, and it's really only been Mitt Romney and Susan Collins and Ben Sasse a little bit who have pushed back against this takeover. There's no opposition. Fox News during the election pushed back against Trump a little bit. They were the first to call Arizona. Is there a point at which you think, I mean, this is to either of you, a point at which anyone else in the party will say, look, we see the possible outcome in the way that you described, both of you described, and we're going to step in and say, no, this isn't okay? Or are they so captured by Trump and they have tied their electoral futures to him that that's just totally off the table?
Well, and by the way, speaking of Fox News in Arizona, remember that Rupert Murdoch was for Tony Blair until he wasn't for Tony Blair. And there's a long history of that. You being from Australia know that better than anyone.
We know a thing or two about that, yeah.
Yeah. So, I think Murdoch sees which way the wind is blowing. And you've seen the New York Post, another Murdoch property, also adjusting its position in recent days. And frankly, from our standpoint, my standpoint, that is encouraging. I mean, what we've seen with, as you said, very rare exceptions since the election, in the week since then, is pretty much an absolute refusal of the Republican Party to acknowledge Trump's defeat. And that suggests they're going to stand with him and go down with him. It also suggests, unfortunately, that they do believe there is a credible path, which perhaps I just outlined, to overturning the legitimate result of the 2020 election. And they're going to march down that road with him. So I don't see, there are a few isolated cases. And certainly Joe Biden has made outreach to the other America a big part of his initial message. But I don't see much evidence. And of course, we waited for this from Donald Trump for 4 years. We thought, okay, one day he will stop the rabble rousing. He will stop governing for one America and try to govern for all Americans. But it never happened. And as Mitt Romney said of the question of his conceding, it's just not in the man. He cannot conceive of the fact that he could be defeated. And so I think this goes on probably down to the line.
But can I jump in just for a short comment? Something similar is happening here as well in Israel, with Bibi's popularity plummeting, but nobody in the Likud willing to say a word about his mishandling, to put it mildly, of the pandemic and its repercussions. And you have to ask yourself why, and that's why I'm asking myself why when I see the Republican, closing the ranks in the last few days. And the answer is actually not so difficult to understand. They have very specific interests, and they don't want to diverge before they see what the outcome is. Now, is that cowardly? Yes. Is it unprincipled? Yes. Is it politically comprehensible? Also, yes. So this phenomenon is not unfamiliar. It's just sad, and in a sense, it shows how superficial the commitment is to democratic norms.
So
Yeah, I think there's one other thing that really strikes me. Naomi, you said 70% of Israelis support Trump. Tens of millions of Americans. You could say in 2016 they weren't quite sure what they're getting. 4 years later, his vote has gone up by over 7 million votes. He won with 63 million votes in 2016. There's been a massive turnout. And, this product has been on the shelf for a long time now. I mean, they know exactly who they're voting for. So the question that interests me, particularly as a lot of the American support, and presumably quite a lot of the Israeli support, comes from religious people who believe in some kind of moral framework, moral and ethical framework to their lives. And yet, you have a president who, by almost any moral or ethical reckoning that I can summon up, and God knows, as a columnist for 4 years, I have tried to look for redeeming features in Donald Trump. The only one I could ever find was that his children, do seem to love him, and I don't know if that's just self-interest, but anyway, I mean, it's something, right? No, so here is a man who is a liar. There's no other way to put it. Who has been provocative in racist ways a number of times during his presidency, who has really no respect for the rule of law, for a free press, all that. But the core of it is moral. He is an indecent human being, totally self-absorbed, incapable of any empathy. So here you have a man of conspicuous moral and ethical indecency, being supported by 70% of Israelis. I don't think of Israelis, certainly not in those numbers, as being immoral or unethical. So there is a disconnect there that I think is some kind of important and fascinating insight into our times. And I'd love to know what you think of it, Naomi. But to me, it's a great and troubling puzzle.
go, Naomi. Yeah.
I share the puzzle, and I share the concern. Obviously, I'm not sure it's only religiously rooted, though. I think we
Yeah.
make our life much too easy if we link it to religiously driven ethical precepts, because otherwise, how can I explain so many Israelis supporting in our case, a cheat, a liar, and somebody who has distinctly abused his office and corrupted the system in its entirety? I can't, on the one hand, but there are other elements that come into play, and Trump has been masterful in drilling down on these elements. The most important being two that I can think of. One is the economy. People, when they go into the ballot box and they cast their ballot, the polling station, they cast their ballot, they also think about their has their situation improved or not. And many Americans feel that it has, and they also are fearful of the uncertainty of something else. And that's one key element. And something, a second element, which is much more elusive, is 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 something that relates to identity and community, which we have not as liberals unpacked sufficiently and addressed. And this is something that we should pay attention to, because we dismiss it instead of dealing with it, and in a sense even respecting that people come from a totally different worldview, and we have to take it into account. And we don't. So
Yeah.
I agree with you on one level, but I don't want to make our task too easy. I think it'd be a mistake in the long
Yeah,
term.
yes, I agree with you. I think there has been far too much, for many years now, far too much contempt from liberal Democrats for people who are intelligent and decent human beings who just think differently. I mean, there are a lot of, you know, thoroughly upstanding Americans among those 70 plus million voters for Trump. And as somebody once said to me in Colorado, nobody ever had their mind changed by being made to feel stupid. And, that is what I think liberals have too often done. On the economy, I was reminded, I was in Alabama in the South recently, and I was having a discussion with a gentleman there who actually is a Democrat. And he said to me with that Southern lilt, money is an awfully soothing thing.
Well, I mean, and Donald Trump certainly doled it out, which I think helped
Right.
give people the feeling that it was one of the few
Yeah.
things he did do. They all got checks with his signature on it, and I think
Yeah.
that made them feel
Yeah.
like they were in a better position now than they were
Just,
years
Yeah.
ago. You go.
just a short comment about what Roger just said. The foundations of American democracy and other democracies as well was a realization that there was disagreement, and one had to find mechanisms and a system in which one can deal with these disagreements. And when you come to think of it, what we're experiencing today in the United States, and not only in the United States, is that these mechanisms aren't working. In other words, something's gone wrong with the belief that rules and institutions can help us resolve disagreements nonviolently. It's not working.
Yeah, and I think to your identity slash community point, which is very important, the demography of the United States is changing quite rapidly. And there are many in the Trump Republican camp who believe that if they allow Joe Biden to become president, that's it. The Republicans will never win again. And there's this existential um, communitarian, if you like, fear about the passing of a certain America, which doesn't
Yeah.
exist anymore, but it exists in people's heads.
So, Nomi, I want you to reflect a little bit. You've been speaking, and I've heard you speak many times about the democratic recession, which is how you've described the trend in a number of democracies around the world. And I think the context I've always heard you speak about it in is within Israel. Will you just talk a little bit about that to give a bit of context to the broader trends elsewhere?
Yeah, I'll do it very briefly because I've done it so often. I've written about it so often. I think even many of the people who are uh, with us uh, today are familiar with the analysis. But broadly speaking, and by the way, I would correct myself. I don't talk about democratic recession now. I think we've got various levels of democratic breakdown. And the question is what the tipping point is. And I just remind everyone that democratic breakdown can go in two directions. It usually manifests itself in centralization and very autocratic tendencies on the one hand, but it also can unleash anarchy and potentially do both at the same time. So erosion, that was true 5 years ago. But we're in a breakdown phase now, and one has to think very carefully about how to deal with it. There are three major elements of democratic breakdown. One is the erosion of democratic rights, individual civil rights, political rights, and collective minority rights. And you see that happening systematically in many democratic countries. Okay, I think what's happened in the United States during the Trump period is a fast forward picture of this process. The second element is the challenge to democratic institutions, and primarily the loss of checks and balances, institutional checks and balances, the role of the opposition, the role of Congress, the balance between the judicial system, the denigration of the guardrails, the media, civil society, etc. What happens is that very delicate accountability between the government or the rulers and the ruled has become unstuck. By the way, causing a great deal of loss of confidence in the system in its entirety. And people don't like to talk about the institutional elements because they're boring, but they're absolutely critical. They're absolutely critical. And the third facet of all of this is the unraveling of democratic norms. I always say that the British have the saying, it's not done. Every democratic country has certain norms which say beyond this you cannot go. They may vary from one democratic country to another, but they've always defined the rules of the game. And the rules of the game have been thrown to the wind. I think Trump is the most extreme example that we know, but he's not the only one. Bolsonaro is another example. Bibi has flaunted these rules so that nobody can even begin to describe them today. And the result is that through the use of fear and anger and incitement and creating an internal enemy between us and them, one essentially creates a situation where polarization is used as an instrument for rulers because they're not bound, or they don't see themselves bound, by the rules of the game that have prevailed up to that period. Put it all together. This creates breakdown, different intensity, different ways, but it's serious. And without addressing each one of these aspects, it's almost impossible to begin to put Humpty Dumpty back together again.
So you mentioned Bibi, and I think this is a good time to pivot. It's good to have that framework to be able to understand all of what's going on. Let's zoom maybe into Israel. What's Bibi's next move? How does he was a bit slow to congratulate Joe Biden. He didn't use the words president-elect, which a number of people pointed out. So what does he do next? He's benefited so much from the Trump administration. So where does he go now?
Well, vis-a-vis the United States or in Israel?
Yeah, but I mean in both, but I imagine that one will flow into the other as well.
Well, I think he's going to sit by and watch what happens, what unfolds in the United States. Roger, he can't but at least try to hope that part of the scenario that Roger depicted gives him something to hang on to. And by the way, he's even spliced that in Likud circles today. They're talking about separating relations with Congress and especially the Senate, assuming a Senate majority, a Republican majority, from the White House, etc. On the other hand, I assume, I know that there have been overtures to Biden people, which is the obvious thing to do under the circumstances. But much more importantly, I think what happened has convinced Netanyahu that he better go to elections as quickly as possible, because the more this drags out on the United States, the more vulnerable politically he becomes in Israel. And I assume there'll be elections in the spring.
That's exactly what we all need, the fourth Israeli election in 18 months or 2 years. Roger, do you want to add what you reckon is next for
Well, it's very striking how prudent he's being toward President-elect Biden, not using that term and clearly hedging his bets to some degree. The Trump administration was a gift to Israel, and Israel effectively had carte blanche to do whatever it wished during this time. I don't think, given the UAE recognition and the deals that were forged there, and now the other shoe has dropped with these massive arms sales announced yesterday by Mike Pompeo to the UAE. I don't think with those being there in place that there'll be some sudden rush to annexation. Try to squeeze that in before Trump departs. And I think actually Bibi has always seen the downside to that and has preferred his kick the can down the road, so-called status quo policy, which is not status quo because the possibility of a two-state peace erodes all the time. If Joe Biden takes office, I don't expect any dramatic immediate change on the Israeli-Palestinian front. I think Joe Biden instinctively and throughout his career has been very, very passionately pro-Israel in his approach. However, he is beholden to the left of the party. It was the left of the party, AOC, the so-called squad, that with millions of others really mobilized this incredible turnout. Maybe Stacey Abrams in Georgia should be named the MVP or most valued player of this election. It's really incredible what happened in Georgia. So he is beholden to that side of the party, and that side of the party is clearly markedly more pro-Palestinian than the Trump administration was, which you'll tell me is not saying a whole lot. But there will clearly be some rebalancing. I would say welcome rebalancing in the American approach. What that yields, I don't know. I'm fairly skeptical. And of course, very soon, Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to become under intense legal pressure. I mean, these cases, these accusations, they're coming home to roost, and I don't think, he can indefinitely shield himself from the consequences.
How close is that?
I agree entirely. If I may, Liam, just jump in with what Roger said. But I want to add 2 points. The cost for Israel of the absence of daylight between Trump and Netanyahu has been very, very deep indeed. It's been profound in 2 respects. Number one, it's created a real breach between U.S. Jewry and between Israel on critical questions. And part of it, by the way, is a value-driven division. And the second element of what's happened, it's created an extraordinary dependency of Israel on the United States, with next to no wiggle room in the international community at the moment. And therefore, there's no question that with a Biden presidency, these 2 elements have to be addressed by whatever Israeli leader. And by the way, just on the issue of annexation, I agree with you. I was never sure Bibi wanted annexation. It's much easier to control and play the game of maintaining a semblance of international legitimacy rather than annex and having the whole world down on you. So non-annexation gives more possibilities for Israeli control of Palestinian lives and defeat of Palestinian self-determination, ironically, than annexation does.
One of the big winners that people are starting to talk about, if Biden wins and everything happens as we hope and expect, or definitely hope, maybe not expect, and Biden takes over, is a realignment in America. And there's 2 ways that, Roger, I wanted you to talk about. One is away from an AIPAC model of pro-Israel engagement and towards a J Street model of Israel engagement, and promoting a resolution to the conflict with the Palestinians as a major foreign policy goal. But secondarily, the Iran deal as well, which I think will be one of the big priorities for Joe Biden. So with both of those, so the other question that I have also is, will Bibi's cachet, because of the way he's hitched his wagon to Trump so much, will his cachet be reduced significantly if/when Biden takes office? And how does that play out for Israel?
Well, I think clearly Prime Minister Netanyahu was stronger when, as Naomi just put it, there was zero daylight between him and the American president. When Joe Biden takes office as president, there will be daylight. And President-elect Biden has spoken to J Street. He clearly shares passionately the vision of 2 states living beside each other in peace and security. And I think American policy will shift in that direction, away from what was essentially a policy driven by the views of the settlers. I mean, Ambassador Friedman was one of them. And that was effectively the policy that the United States pursued, with a complete and cavalier dismissal of Palestinian national aspirations. Among the many other characteristics of the president we currently have is that he is a completely ahistorical figure. He has no interest in or knowledge of history. And when you're dealing with foreign policy, if you're not even prepared to read a briefing paper on history of maybe 8 bullet points, then you're clearly at a disadvantage in comprehending what is actually going on around you, rather than some, Hollywood fantasy. So, yeah, I think it does reduce. I don't know if I'd use the word cachet. I think it reduces the power, actually, of Prime Minister Netanyahu in some quite significant ways. On Iran, it's complicated. I think Democrats, everyone acknowledges. I mean, I was a supporter of the Iran nuclear deal. I think what President Trump did was completely foolish. Nobody believes that the Iran deal was perfect. And now that all this has happened, perhaps it's the moment to have an Iran nuclear deal 2.0. I mean, go back to that as a basis, but try to build out from it, which is what the Trump administration should have done to begin with. Maybe there is some room to do that. I mean, I do think, and perhaps you'll disagree with me, but I think net, the extrajudicial killing of Soleimani, who was an intensely disruptive figure throughout the Middle East, it has in fact created some new possibilities, because there is no second Soleimani. He was a unique figure in the generally pernicious influence he was able to exert.
Naomi, did you want to add on that point?
What concerns me a little bit is that, again, there's an attempt to personalize it on the assumption that Netanyahu is here forever.
Right.
And I don't accept that assumption much beyond the next few months, maybe a little longer. And that's good. That's in a sense reassuring.
I don't want there to be any ambiguity about that.
Yeah, and therefore we have to foresee that we'll be talking about potentially different leaders. What I'm concerned about at the moment generally is this attempt to think that Biden will go back to Obama-like policies, which I'm not sure he will, except for insistence on renewing some form of negotiations on the basis of again, clear advocacy for a two-state solution on the basis of the 1967 boundaries. That's his position. He's repeated it umpteen times. It's important. How this is done is going to have to take into account the recent developments in Israeli relations, mostly with Gulf states. So we're in a new reality, and therefore Biden, I think, is going to go beyond, except on the Iran question, and again, he's going to step gently on that question initially, because he has to, given what's taking place in the region. But I think the most important point wasn't said yet. And stated, I don't think this is going to be in any way a priority at the moment. I may be wrong, but there are a number of domestic issues that have to be tackled. And in a sense, without knowing exactly who his foreign policy advisors are at the moment, I think that foreign policy issues will be maintained, but without great initiatives until the dust settles a bit domestically. I may be wrong, but that's the way I see it at the moment.
As we kind of come to the end of our conversation, I flagged with you both at the beginning that I wanted to end on something a little bit optimistic and hopeful. So maybe, Roger, we'll start with you. Something that gives you hope or confidence. In your last column, you said that you still feel that democracy is inherently strong and you have confidence in the system. Where does your optimism come from? Where does that confidence come from? And then Naomi after that.
Well, it is inspiring that more Americans than ever voted. And the citizen casting that ballot, that the humble citizen, exerting his or her say in the democratic process, that is the system that best corresponds to the human desire to be free. And I think it's not perfect. It's thoroughly imperfect, but nothing perfect, can. The crooked timber of humanity. That's where we are. So, let's work with it. My optimistic scenario is that President Biden, President-elect Biden, will indeed take office January 20. That these subversive attempts by Trump to undermine the democratic process in the United States will be defeated. And at that point, you have to be optimistic for the world, more optimistic for the world, because quite simply, the nightmare will be over. The nightmare will be over. This has been a nightmare. It has involved the abandonment of all the values for which the United States stands and must stand. The American idea is critical to American identity. Without the American idea, America is nothing. We stand for democracy. We stand for freedom. We stand for human rights. We stand for the rule of law. And when, on the contrary, red carpets are being laid out for all the dictators of the world, and we have a president who's uncomfortable with democratic leaders like Angela Merkel, then we've gone through the looking glass into some very dark place. And I think I don't think I'm alone in this. It's only as we begin to see the end of the nightmare that the full dimensions of the nightmare become apparent, because Donald Trump is a political genius of a certain kind. He understands the darkest places in the human psyche, and he understands how to get there through the media. And I think every single American citizen of whatever belief or conviction has felt his or her mind occupied by this man, often, unfortunately, sullied by this man, but certainly in a very insidious way, consumed by this man. And the idea that he could become marginal, that he will pack his bags and leave the White House, and that we will be relieved of this insidious figure occupying our brains, that to me is extremely uplifting and hopeful.
Naomi.
It's so masterfully put. I don't even know how to begin to discuss, so I'll say it in the simplest kind of terms. There are three things that give me hope. The first one is that I saw in the American election something that I wish could happen everywhere in the democratic world, and that is that people reaffirm through the vote their ability and their belief that they have the capacity to make a difference. And this happened in this election. The second point that makes me full of hope, frankly, is the fact that a different tone was inserted, tenor was inserted into the American political atmosphere. And that is one of, let's work together. Let's try to understand each other. By the way, very, very systematically by Joe Biden. And even though it's sometimes boring and it seems naive, the attempt to recreate a civil discourse is so important when emotions run high, and it's this reappearance of that discourse which gives a tremendous amount of hope. And finally, what gives me even more hope is that liberal democracy has yet to find a better alternative because it expresses and articulates the human spirit. And therefore, when I see it being reconfirmed in various forms, it becomes both a challenge and a source of satisfaction. So you can't not be an optimist in this dreary situation.
Well, let that be a wonderful final note for our event. I want to thank both of you very much for joining us from your two opposite corners of the world. Just before we do end, I just want to pay tribute to one of our supporters in Melbourne, Harry Keston, who passed away earlier this week. Harry was one of our supporters from the very beginning. I actually looked through some of my email archives and I saw that he both attended and then replied very favorably to events that he attended with both of you in particular. So he would have loved to have been here, I think. He supported some of our most important and challenging work, particularly with Bedouin citizens in the Negev to help them get electricity and water and housing and all of the important things that all Israeli citizens should enjoy. So I just wanted to wish his family and friends, I know some of whom are joining us, a long life. And note that really for all of us, Harry's memory will be a blessing. Thank you again to everyone joining us at home. Thank you to Roger and Naomi. Let's keep that optimistic spirit and wish you all a very good night. Thank you.
Thank you.